Hi, I'm Pastor Chris Titus, and we're continuing our conversation of the Gospel of Mark, the review that we're doing for preparation for Lent that's coming up. We are in Act 4 of this gospel play written some time ago, the first gospel that was written and recorded and circulated among believers after Jesus' death and resurrection. I say we're getting ready for Lent. Lent is a season for us to reflect and think about our relationship with Jesus Christ, facilitated through the death and resurrection, the plan of salvation that God put in place. And so Lent is a time we're supposed to focus on those things. The Gospel of Mark is written not by an eyewitness, but in this case, Mark's source for his information is the Apostle Peter. Early church leaders referred to this document as Mark's interpretation of Peter, or being the interpreter of Peter. So why is this gospel so important? We talked about it last week. This is really the essential, basic information you need to know about Jesus' life as it leads to the cross and the importance of what happened during those time periods. It is a fast-paced, easy to digest recollection of what happened. And when people ask me where to start reading in the New Testament, I always say the Gospel of Mark. And so we have reviewed so far several scripture passages, including Jesus sleeping in a boat, head on a pillow, while the storm raged around the disciples. And we learned from that the Lord cares for us, even though things around us may be difficult, even though we may wonder whether God cares about us when we have various seasons of anxiety or stress in our lives. But God is there. He is either there to calm the storm itself or calm the storm and fear inside of us and get us through that moment or time in life when things look so difficult. So we talked about that. We also talked about some of the healings that take place and teachings that take place in the Gospel of Mark. We looked at the depiction of Jesus interacting with the deranged man who was living in the tombs, who was possessed by a multitude of demons. Jesus' healing of this man demonstrates clearly the authority of God. The legions of demons that were in this man were nothing compared to the authority that Jesus had to cast them out. And we have to remember also that Jesus then turned around and took the demon-possessed man, no longer plagued by those demons, and sent him out as a witness, as someone who could tell the surrounding towns of the great things that God has done. And as I said last week, this is top shelf evangelism. This is really the way that we best share our faith, is through our own personal testimonies about what God has done in our lives and how it's made a difference. And this is what people want to know. And so it's never an issue of you have to be a theologian in order to share your faith. The truth of the matter is that we best share our faith through our personal stories, how God has rescued us and how God has helped us. And this is what we learned from the story of the demon-possessed man. We also considered the amazing restoration that Jesus does in the life of the synagogue leader, Jairus, whose daughter is dead. And Jesus raises her from the dead. And what's important about that particular narrative is understanding Jesus turns to Jairus when he's been told his daughter has died and says, "Don't be afraid, just believe." And sometimes we need to hear that calming voice in our life too when things are chaotic. Don't be afraid, just believe. Just trust that God is working on your circumstances. And so we move on today to Mark chapter 6. There's some interesting passages there, also staying on theme with Mark's gospel of identifying Jesus' authority and then talking about his mission. This chapter opens with Jesus actually going back to his hometown of Nazareth. Now you would think that he would get a great fanfare and welcoming there, but that's not what happens. And what we see is that Jesus is not treated well there. They are very skeptical of who he is, and they only see him superficially. They only see him as the local boy who has now grown into a man. They pretty much ignore some of the miracles and the other things that are adding to Jesus' reputation at the time. They only see him as Mary's son or the brother of James or Jude. They can't get past who they knew him to be for now being something more impressive. They can't get past that. And we've all experienced this to some degree in our lives. And it's when people who we love, who are close to us, family, friends, may see us for what we used to be and not for what we are. And that is always troubling, sad, painful, discouraging. People know that we follow Jesus, but they're still stuck seeing us as we were prior to our salvation, prior to us changing our lives and committing to Christ. And that is always very discouraging. And this happens to all of us from time to time. People tend to only focus on our past, and they are not willing really to hear anything different from us because they know who we used to be. And this is a form of rejection, but we can't let rejection box us in. If words about our change don't work, if words about us following Jesus don't change the minds of people who know us the best, then it will be our actions and our attitudes that will do that over a period of time. It will take time for that to happen. Share your faith in words, certainly, but most often we share our faith through the way people perceive us and they begin to see the changes that are happening. It will take time for people to recognize this. So it happened to Jesus. He goes back to Nazareth. He's not able to do any miracles there, and Mark tells us it's because people do not believe. And this is a reoccurring phrase in Mark's gospel. People we most easily identify are the Pharisees and religious leaders. They don't believe. The way we learn, some of the townspeople don't believe, especially in Nazareth, about Jesus. And then we learn that even the disciples have a problem at times with this. It always comes back to a heart issue, a hard heart, as Mark refers to it. Unbelief, stubbornness, pride, clinging to sin, whatever it might be, that causes a person to have a hard heart towards the gospel, towards Jesus, towards any sort of relationship with God. And yet we still need to be patient and consistent and remain in devotion to Jesus. So eventually a hard heart of somebody who's observing us will be softened. The best example I can give is I can remember when I told my dad that I was no longer going to be an attorney and that I was going to devote my time and effort towards being a pastor. And he was not supportive. I don't know whether he liked telling people that his son was a lawyer. I'm not sure what that was about. Probably a little of that. But I think it was mostly he felt like I was making a bad career decision. And he was trying to be supportive, but it didn't really come off that way. And so he could only see it superficially. And then once he came to my church and heard the preaching and heard what was going on there, he came to me and said, "You made the best decision of your life." And so it takes time for people to recognize that your faith is changing you in a positive way. And so sometimes we have to give them that grace and give them that patience and time. But I know it hurts when it happens. So Mark then goes on to tell us in chapter 6 about another miracle. It's a fairly well-known one. It's called the feeding of the 5,000. And most Christians know this story. Jesus is out in the middle of nowhere. He's preaching to a very large crowd, far away from towns. And basically it begins to get dark and the people haven't had any food. And the disciples don't want to do anything about it. It's as if they are saying, let the people figure out their food problem. But Jesus is not having any part of that. And so listen to what happens in Mark 6, beginning in verse 37. But he, Jesus, answered, "You give them something to eat." They said to him, "That would take more than a half year's wages. Are we to go and spend that much on bread and give it to them to eat?" "How many loaves do you have?" Jesus asked. "Go and see." When they found out, they said, 5 and 2 fishes. Then Jesus directed them to have all the people sit down into groups on the green grass. So they sat down in groups of 150s, taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, and looking up to heaven, he, Jesus, gave thanks and broke the loaves. He gave it to them, to his disciples, to distribute to the people. He also divided the 2 fish among them. They all ate and were satisfied, and the disciples picked up 12 baskets of broken pieces of bread and fish. The number of men who had eaten was 5,000. So there's no question this is a miracle. In fact, the numbers bear that out. Likely there were women and children there, so we could be talking 7,000 that get fed. But this idea of there not being enough is something that we have to look at. But I first want to look at this miracle a little differently than is normally taught, and that is what Jesus does with the large group of people there. The first thing he does is he organizes them in small groups to advocate for them, right? He tells the disciples we're going to help them, and then he teaches them, and then he feeds them. This is a model that is something that is still used in the church today. In fact, this fall we're going to do something similar. We're going to organize some small groups in people's homes. There'll be some sort of study or conversation or discussion, and then of course there will be food. At least a minimum, some good snacks. So this is a way for us to learn and strengthen our faith that really comes from a biblical model that's found in the Gospel of Mark. So if you're interested in participating in any of those groups, let me know, and we'll certainly include you. We'll likely be meeting in 4 or 5 different locations on different days of the week, day or evening. Each group will be assigned a topic, and we'll talk about that together. So, like everything in Mark, we've moved fast, we transition quickly to something else, to the next miraculous moment. So take a look at Mark 6, beginning in verse 45. Immediately, Jesus made his disciples get into a boat and go ahead of him to Bethsaida, while he dismissed the crowd. After leaving them, he went up to the mountainside to pray. Later that night, the boat was in the middle of the lake, and he was alone on the land. He saw the disciples straining at the oars because the wind was against them. Shortly before dawn, he went out to them, walking on the lake. He was about to pass them, but when they saw him walking on the lake, they thought he was a ghost. They cried out because they all saw him and were terrified. Immediately he spoke to them and said, "Take courage, it is I. Do not be afraid." Now, most translations will read this as, "Take courage, I am," which is a Hebrew reference to Moses at the burning bush when he asked, "What's God's name?" And God replies, "I am." So here's Jesus telling the believers in the boat that he is God, I am. And he is cementing his identity, at least from Mark's point of view. Now, think about this for a moment. The disciples are in the middle of the Sea of Galilee. The waters are rough, they're straining, the winds are blowing hard, and Jesus sees them. He does not immediately stop the storm. In fact, we're told he waits till dawn, so probably a couple of hours goes by, before he steps in and resolves the issue. And this should be something we should ponder a little bit more often. We have to understand that God may allow the wind or the challenge or the difficulty to remain in our life before initiating any sort of rescue. It could possibly be to teach us something, to give us some sort of insight, to understand what the wind or the challenge feels like to us, so that when he does initiate a rescue, we are so much more appreciative and we notice what he has done. So this appears to be kind of what Jesus is doing here with his disciples, so that they can appreciate the awesomeness of God when their wind or when their challenge is taken away. And we need to learn from that. We need to fully celebrate, appreciate, be thankful when we experience the awesomeness of God, most likely from answered prayer about some sort of challenge that we are in. Because the alternative is to just watch the storm go through our lives, watch it pass, the winds, the howling rains, whatever it might be, grab a towel, dry ourselves off, and say, wow, that was a tough time we got through there. I'm so glad it ended. And that's why our church sign outside says something to the effect of, do you see a miracle or do you see a coincidence? We often miss the miracles that God is doing in our lives because we're focused on the storm and the passing of the storm and not the answered prayer itself. We need to let God know that we appreciate His goodness. We do that through responding prayer, thanksgiving. We do that through reading Scripture. We certainly do that through worshiping every Sunday in church and finding ways to honor God throughout the week. Okay, so the final big point I want to take out of this particular story, this water moment in Mark's Gospel, is something like this. So let's take a look at Mark 6, beginning in verse 50. Immediately, Jesus spoke to them and said, "Take courage, it is I. Do not be afraid." Then he climbed into the boat with them, and the wind died down. They were completely amazed, for they had not understood about the loaves. Their hearts were hardened. When they crossed over, then the lands of the Gennesets, and anchored there. So Mark goes to the trouble here of pointing out that the disciples did not understand what had happened with the loaves and the fishes because their hearts were hardened. Now, he doesn't provide the reason their hearts were hardened, just the fact that they completely missed the miracle itself of the loaves and fishes and the feeding of the 5,000, 6,000, 7,000, how many were there? They missed it because their hearts were not right. And we too will miss amazing things if we have a hard heart towards God. This is the brutal truth that all followers of Jesus must realize, that there are times that we are dense to the teachings of God. We are ignorant to what God is actually doing in our lives because we have an underlying heart issue. And so Mark points it out in the disciples. Remember, this information is coming from Peter, who was there. So Peter is pointing out the disciples didn't understand because their hearts were hardened. And later on, we'll read about other folks like the Pharisees who act in the same way. General disbelief of God and what God is doing. This is a heart issue. And so I challenge you and myself that we need to think about the fact that our hearts may not always be prepared for God. Someone once said, "Hard hearts are rarely born. They are formed through fear, loss, and pride." So the reason our hearts are challenging sometimes to us, that are hardened because we can't receive what God is giving us or understand what God is presenting, is because of fear, loss, pride. I would also point out sin in general. Jesus comments in Mark chapter 8, "The hardness of the heart leads to a blindness of the mind." How true is that? The harder we are, the more difficult, the more self-interested, stubborn, unable to really appreciate what God is doing, the less we see. It's almost like a spiritual blindness. We miss the amazing things that God is doing because of our own stubbornness or our unwillingness to look to God and appreciate all He has done. So, what does God need to do with regard to our hard hearts? I would argue nothing. The hardening of our hearts are choices that we make, whether it's pride or sin or something else. God just needs to continue to do what God does, to be I am, to show us the amazing things that are happening. And so we will then have to let go of some of the things that cause us to have hard hearts, judgment of others, or unforgiveness, or the lack of grace, whatever it might be, that renders us blind to some of the amazing things that are happening around us. It happened to the first disciples. They would have a miracle happen and they just couldn't process it because they couldn't recognize the amazing things that God was doing, the amazing things that Jesus was doing. And so to see God more clearly, we have to get our hearts right. And that's what the season of Lent is all about, to focus our mind, our thoughts, and ponder the relationship we have with God so that we can draw closer to Him. So this week, let your heart be more open to the opportunities that God puts in your path, and there will be opportunities this week for us to see the amazing things that God is doing. After all, we don't want to be blind. We don't want to miss the miracles that He has prepared for us. Amen? There'll be a video attached right down there. I hope you enjoy it. Until the next time we gather, be blessed.